Welcome into a new Winner Hughes podcast as we get you ready for the 49ers and Cowboys Sunday night football. Rick, obviously, growing up, this was a rivalry that we watched when you had battles against the Cowboys and Troy Aikman and Emmitt Smith and Michael Irvin matching up against, Joe Montana first, obviously, but then Steve Young, Jerry Rice. And there were so many great games for these two teams. And then it kind of died. It was nothing for a long, long time. Just kind of fueled by like your former hatred of friends that you grew up rooting against in that old rivalry. And it's kind of reignited in the last few years, this Cowboys and 49ers matchups in the postseason, which what you need for a rivalry, you have to have the same goals. You have to be good at the same time. So overall, just right now, as we get into this premier matchup ahead of a Sunday night clash between the 49ers and Cowboys, do you feel a little bit more anticipation for this game than maybe the first four games the 49ers have played going into the season?
Yeah, those big rivalry games were big rivalries because it usually meant whoever came on top was gonna win the Super Bowl. And so when things kind of fell apart for the Niners, and we were just looking for a guy that could consistently get first downs. Then we finally got Jimmy G and started on that trajectory again. And the Cowboys have had their own trajectory, and part of that involving their pursuit for their new stadium, which they got. And they've got their guy in Dak Prescott. And Tony Romo, I think for a long time just kept leading them very close, but just didn't really have the gumption or whatever it was to get them over the line, and so yeah, they've got their guy Dak, and we've got our guy, and Jerry Jones said the road to the Super Bowl goes through San Francisco. So that's where we are again, and that's where the rivalry's back up. And because of that, yeah, I think there is a lot more anticipation for this game. I think we really do enjoy the Niners blowouts because it's a less taxing on your own personal health just watching. And so, but it's kind of gotten a little boring. They're just kicking everybody's butts. Like, let's see some football, and I think we are this weekend.
Yeah, I'm excited for this matchup. I think part of it is when you see your team get off to such a great start, and obviously the 49ers are one of the few undefeated teams left in the NFL. They're 4-0. And as you mentioned, it's been relatively easy for them through these first four games. The wins have come pretty easy. They've dominated, which is what you want to do if you're one of those dominant teams. The Cowboys have had a pretty easy go of it for the most part. They've played some, teams that they just absolutely crushed. And one of the most boring games we've watched this year was their dominance over the Giants early on this season. But I am excited to see this because, like you said, you want to have it be real. You want to have it feel real when your team's doing well. And the 49ers and Cowboys are two teams that have a track record. They were expected to be good. They have been good. And now it's the first time that we're watching the 49ers run into a team that was expected to be good, has been good, and they're going to kind of clash on it. Have you been feeling a little bit more excitement that it feels good, or is there a little bit of scariness that, like, man, I don't want to see something get exposed here that maybe makes me a little bit more worried?
My fear is that Trey Lance is the difference maker in some way or form, and that he comes in and we get beat by Trey Lance. That's my fear. Other than that, I'm excited for this game. What about you?
I think you bring up a good point. Sometimes I do feel like these things get like a little overblown when a team will like grab somebody off of a practice squad to try and get like a little bit of insight. But it does remind me a little bit of what the former boxing training, Manny Pacquiao's trainer, Freddie Roach, used to talk about. They didn't study other boxers. They studied tendencies, what a guy likes to do, how they like to run out of that. And I do wonder, because it's not a playoff game, but if you have to put that kind of level of thinking into your game plan, and we talked about this in baseball, it gets into a little bit of like, he knows that I know that he knows, and like how you think through that. Because I think one of the things that the 49ers under Kyle Shanahan have done really well is scheme things up. And you hear when people try to knock Brock Purdy, they talk about the scheme that Kyle Shanahan uses to get guys wide open. That's not Brock Purdy's fault that Kyle Shanahan calls good plays that get guys wide open. But you're right. I mean, you've got a guy in Trey Lance who has spent the last few years trying to learn this offense as well as he could to be able to call things out. And if a team can figure out what those tendencies are or what those tells are, it does kind of make it an uphill climb for that team to do the things that they like to do. Now, for the 49ers, we're talking about one of the most talented rosters in the NFL. And you look at the dominance they've had, scoring 30 points in each of the last 4 games. There's been games where George Kittle was a non-factor. This last win over the Cardinals, Deebo Samuel, one of the best playmakers in the NFL, was a non-factor. And the 49ers have relied a lot on Christian McCaffrey and Brandon Ayuk in the first 4 weeks to kind of be the dominant forces on offense, that you have these kind of other ways that you can be successful if a team tries to just take away something you like to do. And I'm wondering if this is the week, at least for me, that we see a bigger game from like a George Kittle, who's been relatively quiet, or a Deebo Samuel.
It's just hard to tell because they have so many weapons. Is it really that these guys are going off, or is the defense focused on shutting them down? But they have so many weapons that it's just constantly effective. And so I think George Kittle has a long track record of being a watch out, this guy can do damage for you. And I think with Ayuk, there was a little more like make him prove himself, and he is proving himself, so you can't take your eye off of him. Then you got Christian McCaffrey, who, Shanahan is admitting is difficult to take him out of the game because he has so much versatility. Even having him in there when you're not using him is a threat. You have to keep your eyes on him. So I know we are talking about he's being overused. You got to bring some other guys in there, and we are worried about him getting injured, and him specifically, because just like we were saying, even if he's just in there, you got to worry about him. And then if he's injured, you can't put him in there. Well, that's one less weapon. Now we can start focusing on these other guys. And we saw what a difference he made. And before he came and after he came, yes, there's a lot of other factors in there, but he is clearly just a huge player, one of the top guys in the entire league right now.
Yeah, one of the big talking points for this week was whether or not Christian McCaffrey is setting himself up early on as the MVP favorite in the NFL, especially for a non-quarterback. It's been a decade since somebody that was a quarterback that wasn't a quarterback won the MVP. You have to go back to Adrian Peterson in 2012, the last time somebody who wasn't a quarterback won the MVP award. McCaffrey leads the league in all yards, all-purpose yards. He's got 600 yards rushing and receiving. A lot of that has come rushing. He leads the league in rushing attempts, which is kind of something that a lot of people are keeping an eye on as well, of how much usage he gets into. And as you mentioned, it is part of that tendency game that we talked about with the Cowboys, is sometimes you want him on the field just for the other team to account for him, because if he's healthy and you have Elijah Mitchell on there, do teams start keying up, be like, okay, pass, Mitchell's in, pass? You can't have it be that obvious what your tell's going to be. And, they did a good job of that 2 weeks ago when Elijah Mitchell was healthy, and they used him. I remember a couple situations where they used him in a 3rd and 2 situation in like the second half, and they gave him the ball. And then they came back later in that exact same formation, and they gave the ball to Elijah Mitchell. And then later in the game, they used that same formation with Mitchell, and they passed it. But they just did a good job mixing him in when he had those limited snaps, way more limited than I think you and I think that they should be if he's healthy. But you can't make it that obvious. It's like, all right, Christian McCaffrey's out of the game, line up and take away Ayuk, like you've got to have it. And the Niners, obviously, they have the depth of weapons that they don't just have to be reliant on CMC. But the way he started this season, I get what Shanahan's talking about, because everything he does is working really well right now.
It is the concern for Niners fans is we have seen what injuries do to your team and to your Super Bowl dreams. And we've seen it constantly. And for last year to have that run that they did, to go to quarterback number 3 and still make it to the NFC Championship game, is just absolutely unimaginable. And so we've constantly seen what happens with injuries, with Jimmy G getting hurt and just all these other things. And so we know that it happens. We know it can happen at any time. It's part of the game. but we're ultra concerned about it, right? And it's like, hey man, in some ways you're playing with fire. It's a blowout win against the
Yeah.
Steelers. Take him out, you know? And so it could happen on any play, it could happen at any time. Hopefully nothing ever does. But I think a lot of times we're like holding our breath, and we are just like, this happens. Don't forget this happens. And it keeps happening. So let's do our best, because that's the only thing that can stop this 49ers team. If they are healthy, nobody can stop them.
It's a good point. And I think there is part of what's happened in the Bay Area specifically with watching what has happened with the Warriors, where like the focus is on the postseason. The regular season has become a little meaningless when you're that good and you're just, you know that you have the talent to win and get to the playoffs and then make that run and make it really matter and count. And I think there is a little bit of that because the 49ers have been to the playoffs when they've been healthy. They go to the NFC title game. And then the things that they've run into usually are injury related with what has held them back. 2019, they made it to the Super Bowl and they lost that game. We can, go over that and ad nauseum. But the other reasons have usually been injury related, like the year that they struggled and Nick Bosa got hurt. You think about last year, obviously, Brock Purdy getting hurt and the huge impact that had in the NFC title game. But you can't quite do that in the NFL the way you can in the NBA, where you can kind of cruise and just kind of treat it because the intensity of the game is so different. The physicality is so different that a guy might get hurt just by taking it a little too easy in some of those games.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you on some of these games when it's been a blowout and you're like, why is Brock Purdy still in there to hand the ball off to Christian McCaffrey? This should be Sam Darnold and Jordan Mason running out the clock right here as those guys cut to shots on Fox of Purdy, giving a high five or putting an arm over George Kittle or something like that. But I do understand where that tendency comes from. And I think you're right. Like Kyle Shanahan will get crushed if Christian McCaffrey winds up getting hurt and has a questionable part of the season where maybe it's not sure if he's going to come back. I also think that there's part of this, and you hear that from Christian McCaffrey's comments. You can't think like that. You have to think like, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to do my job, because if you start getting worried about that other element about getting hurt, it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And that's it, right? There's different people with different mindsets here. We're sitting here as fans who want Christian McCaffrey to be healthy the entire way through, and we know how much depends on that. I absolutely agree. Like, he cannot take that mentality that like, oh no, I need to be fragile. He cannot. He needs to go out there and going, I'm indestructible every single time, and I'm going to get the end zone every time. As the coach, you sometimes need to protect that guy from himself, and as the coach, I get it. You're not a fan either. This is results based. You do have to get that. If Mitchell comes in and he's not moving that ball and you're not getting those first downs, then yeah, you do have to have Christian McCaffrey in. But I'm just saying, as a fan, like sometimes when it's getting late in the game, and like you said, Brock Purdy, Christian McCaffrey, it's just making me hold my breath.
Yeah.
And these are like blowout games where I feel like I shouldn't be having anxiety here like I do on these closer games, but there's always a way.
So just getting into this matchup that the 49ers have coming up on Sunday night against the Cowboys, we've been talking about how we expect this game to be a lot closer, a lot more contentious. I think the 49ers against Arizona had a first down on something like 50% of their plays led to a first down. So it was just constantly being able to turn things over and not get into these situations that require too much stress, not just from a fan's sake, but just having to do your job. Dallas, a much better defense. They do a really good job of being able to put pressure on other teams' quarterbacks. Micah Parsons is right there with like the Aaron Donalds and Nick Bosa's as the guys you mentioned as the top defensive players in the league. And we've seen how difficult the Cowboys can make it on the 49ers. And we've seen how difficult the 49ers can make it on the Cowboys. You can't just look at past history and what happened in the last playoff game and translate that over, because each team makes big adjustments to how they're going to play when they have that matchup happen. Obviously, we talked about the Trey Lance effect, and maybe that helps the Cowboys be able to identify some things the 49ers like to do. But overall, if you're looking at this game, and the plan's not going the way the 49ers anticipated, the way that they've just been able to feed Christian McCaffrey, get long passes to Brandon Ayuk, What do you think the next adjustment is for the 49ers? Is it going to be, we see George Kittle featured kind of in that intermediate kind of game? Is it going to be surprises with Kyle Juszczyk getting more involved in things? Like what is the next evolution that you think, hey, if the Cowboys are taking away what the 49ers have liked to do in the first 4 weeks, this is where they go next?
I just really like what Brock Purdy does with his decision making. When you look at Brock Purdy's numbers, like they're not like 400 yards passing and 4 touchdowns, like Brock Purdy has, very respectable numbers, but he's also smart with what he does, and I don't think he forces things, and he finds his best option. So like, what will we see? I think that's up to what Brock sees. And I think they just have so many options that they will find a way to get you no matter what. I think I don't think we can look past this game. I don't think the players will look past this game. I think they understand that there's a rivalry and a long history. And sorry, that's the 11:20.
I know the 11 o'clock national emergency alarm. Yeah,
everyone's
gets it.
Gonna
Yeah.
know what time we recorded.
Yeah.
No, I think the players know the history. They understand. They know that they can be part of this, a new rivalry. And they're rivalries for a reason. When those games fell apart, like, yeah, they didn't really have much to play for. And I saw recently a reporter talk to Dak Prescott and go, oh, how were your feelings of, last season?
Yeah.
And his face was just kind of like, is that a serious question?
Like, you're just trying to piss me off.
And guess what? I'm sure it did. And when you light a fire on someone's ass like that, you got to watch out, because Dak Prescott could go 400 yards and 4 touchdowns. So you always have to show respect to your opponent, which I think the Niners do and will do. But like that reporter just kind of giving them that fire, you don't want to do that, because I think he already understands the history of the teams. I think he understands he can be part of the new history for his franchise. And there is a little chip on his shoulder on how it went last year.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of like trying to establish that NFL hierarchy that still goes on early on in the season, where the 49ers came into this year obviously believing that they are a Super Bowl contender. They had a really bad taste in their mouth, as the players go, from the way that things ended in the NFC title game. And the season has started so kind of effortlessly, at least just as far as NFL standards go, with how they've been able to do things. And I think the Cowboys are in a little bit more of a prove it mode, that this game probably for a regular season game carries a little bit more meaning for them in trying to kind of establish themselves amongst those elite teams. Because if you look around the NFL right now, I think you'd say in the NFC, it's the 49ers and Eagles that have set themselves apart. And then you've got the Cowboys are that next tier down. So going out and beating a team like the 49ers does a lot more for the Cowboys' credibility than it does hurt the 49ers' credibility, as long as it's not some tremendous blowout or something like that. Knocking on wood down there. And then, there's probably 4 or 5 teams that you would put in that top tier, right? 49ers, Eagles, you'd put the Chiefs up there. You'd probably put the Dolphins up there, and the Bills are probably the top 5 teams. And then you've got that next tier down. The Cowboys are certainly on that level. And you look around the league, and there's a couple other teams that you could see making that leap and getting up to where the 49ers have been. But that's where I do wonder how this game happens, because if you're the Niners and you do lose this game, the obvious narrative is that it's a refocus, right? It's like, hey, this is the level we have to be at, and we know that. And we know we have to do that every week. Also, it's one of those good kind of problems, because they have won their first 4 games, but they are getting into the tougher part of their schedule now.
Yeah, I just think the Niners are definitely the strongest team. I think they are a tier ahead above the Cowboys. I think what I'm kind of looking at this year is like that movie 300, and Trey Lance could be the guy that the Spartans were hey, you got to go.
Yeah.
And he ended up
couldn't lift the shield. Yeah.
So that's my concern, that Trey Lance plays that role, and that's it. So other than that, I'm standing with the 300.
Hey, they've got the right colors, right? Red and gold.
They are. I'm with Brock. This is San Francisco.
49ers and Cowboys on Sunday Night Football. It's going to be a big matchup. You can catch new episodes of the Winner Hughes podcast every week. You can find us on social media at Winner Hughes. You can find me on social media at Vegas Joe Hughes. We'll have new episodes up every week and can't wait to talk more Niners football.